Okay, baby.
All right, here we go. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this a good volume?
Yes.
All right, cool. First, I want to say good afternoon. My name is Robert Jackson. I'm here with Megan Hester and Roseanne Tung and our entire team here from the NYU Metro Center. I want to start out by saying thank you to Yeshi and Lucas for providing the physical and intellectual space today, as well as words of wisdom along the way. It has been a year since the inaugural Day for Black Lives conference, and while I wasn't there the first time, I'm excited to be here now. And in that time, our team has explored the intersection between big data, education, and Black lives, and how it impacts Black children. Today's presentation is a little non-traditional. Richie did a great job of talking about storytelling. In this case, we're not going to tell a story with a beginning, a climax, and an end. But what we hope to do here is prove that, basically admit that we need your help, and we need y'all to be leaning into this today. The same way that last year's conference inspired Metro Center to ask the question, what is our role in imagining a world that empowers Black children? Today our goal is to spark something in everyone here today to ask, what can I do? So as I talk through this research, I hope that something is inspired in you to act and to pioneer a way forward without a clear path. Our research started by asking a few questions. As we sat in this very sweet intersection right there, we asked ourselves, who's conducting this research already? What are they investigating as they look through these three spaces? And what are they finding? Now, through our literature review, we found that there actually wasn't very much empirical research addressing the intersection between big data, education, and how it impacts Black lives. There's rarely any information at all even talking about race and the intersection between big data and Black lives, to be honest. That big data mostly talks about privacy and monetization. And that race is, like I mentioned before, an afterthought. And most importantly, very little is done to emphasize community-based solutions or introduce insights from those communities most impacted by big data and education. Now, after pouring into the literature review, we didn't stop there. We talked to basically some influencers in this space. We conducted an interview protocol where we interviewed activists, education, justice academics, data scientists, and tech entrepreneurs, using an interview protocol that asked them the questions such as, who's talking about this? What are they seeing? And what can we do to ensure that this technology, this database technology, is being used to empower Black children and not being used to be weaponized to reinforce historical oppression? I want to get this out of the way now. All y'all remind me of my family. But more importantly, I want to say that everyone in this room is familiar with the legacy of structural oppression that this country calls incremental progress. And I want to let you know today that big data and education is no different. And that may sound drastic, but as you'll see in these examples and as we walk through this work, it'll become more real every second. We've seen institutions use big data to corrupt our democracy and reinforce predatory loan practices and use it redlining in the 21st century. And while these stories appear omnipresent in the news coverage, very little is used to contextualize the impact on public education. Now, this, of course, is a generalization, but when activists like yourself and those that are not in the room get involved in these efforts, it's usually inspired by an individual incident or a personal injustice. Similarly, when academics start studying this space, they focus on neutral topics like how knowledge is delivered, or how do we change the way we impact education overall, rather than talking about the structural inequalities that have existed for years and years. This is not meant to discourage anyone, and I mean no disrespect, but our goal is to frame this work of big data and education as a larger social justice issue. And our goal is to offer knowledge to activists, parents, and students, and those most acutely impacted by big data and education, so that they see themselves as agents of change and not victims of oppression. Ultimately, we want to see Black leaders use big data tools as tools for equity and change, rather than another invisible hand pushing down on them. Now I want to pause here and give you time to soak in this great American poet. I want to acknowledge the wisdom in the room. Like I said, y'all are like family to me, and as the oldest in a generation, I spend a lot of time being told, shh, boy, hush and listen. So I hope you can listen to me for a couple more minutes, and then after that, I want to soak in all the knowledge in this room. And I also hope that what we do today inspires something in you to not only learn, but to pursue moving into new paths and see this as a beginning of something great. The 4 questions we hope to address today. What is big data? What is big data with respect to education equity? What is big data as it moves against education equity and justice? And what are the tools that can be used by community organizers, parents, and students to change the way we use big data to advance education equity? Now, before we get started, I also want to flag these pieces of paper that have been handed out to you. There's a lot of terms on them. Please don't feel like you need to memorize or do a crossword puzzle or anything like that. I just encourage you to refer back to them when you hear key buzzwords in the cases we bring up later as we move through this research. Now, in our research, we found there were 3 major buckets of big data in education: resource data, administrative data, and clickstream data. So the purpose of these cases that we show here today are meant to contextualize those 3 types of data in public education to make them more real and more tangible. I'm going to give you these examples so that as we move into our small groups, you actually get a better idea of what could be possible and what isn't already happening. Our first case is set in Philadelphia, starting in 2014. Now this image might be familiar to some. This is a cover photo from an article written by our keynote speaker, Meredith Rosser, NYU professor, and just all-around genius. She was able to illuminate the inequalities in the Philadelphia district school system by analyzing resource data. The PhD professor was unable to help her first grader with their homework because she didn't have the right textbook. This led her to a really interesting question, but really a simple question. Could a shortage of textbooks be the reason that Philadelphia students struggled in the standardized testing environment in Philadelphia? So, here's some background on Philadelphia between the year 2012 and 2014. 79% of students in Philadelphia were designated as free or reduced lunch students eligible, and less than half of the students in Philadelphia passed the standardized test in Philadelphia. Also, only 64% of students at the time graduated. In short, the learning standards in the state did not keep pace. The learning standards advanced and the exams changed, but the textbooks stayed the same. Meredith and her volunteers actually committed 2 years to building technology that could figure out what books were missing and how much it would cost to replace those books. Most importantly, what she found after this 2 years of research and volunteer effort, like by activists similar to those in this room now, she found that the district actually had no idea what books they had on hand and what they needed. They'd actually invested money in some form of technology, but no one was actually keeping it up to date, and yeah, they just sat there. The other thing that I found most kind of disheartening to me was, on average, district schools were missing 75% of the recommended curriculum and textbooks. That's metaphorically as if your child walked into the room, went into class every day, and only had 1 of every 4 books they needed to pass the test. That being said, after years of activist effort and technology engagement, Meredith and her team were able to enact change in the city of Philadelphia. And in 2015, the district increased its discretionary funding from $40 to $165 per pupil. Now, this may not sound like a great victory, but up until 2015, $0 of that 40 was even allocated to textbooks. So this is just one example in which people spending time and effort not only dealing with the technology of big data, but engaging the communities most impacted to come in and solve the problem can make change. Our second example focuses on administrative data. Now, back in 2010, Wake County, North Carolina, I saw there's Raleigh over here. Yeah, my sister's Raleigh, so respect. In 2010, In 2010, Wake County, North Carolina partnered with Harvard School of Government, sorry, MIT people, Harvard School of Government to address the structural inequalities in their Algebra for All program. The question they wanted to ask was whether they could use an algorithm to analyze student data in learning management systems, which is one of those words that's going to come up over and over again, to place students in math courses more effectively than teachers. Now, in short, between 2010 and 2013, which is the span of the research, they were able to find that the algorithm was less biased than teachers in placing middle school students in high school, in geometry in high school level courses by 9th grade. Rather than being influenced by a student's race or socioeconomic status or other forms of implicit bias, students in geometry courses were placed by basically what they had done previously in school. Now imagine that, being placed in a program based off your previous achievement. And they actually passed those courses. Now unfortunately, as you look at the findings, it's not all good news. The study also found that this success did not carry over to high school, and they categorized this as a leaking pipe problem. This goes back to something I mentioned earlier when I mentioned how most big data projects focus on individualized intervention instead of addressing structural challenges. This report, or this project, was a very limited space to Wake County middle school students, and it addressed only a couple hundred students at that. It was not designed to solve a structural issue, but at the same time, it presents a very interesting blueprint for implementing similar interventions at scale. The third example I want to point out to you is clickstream data. Again, this is an example of a researcher who was interested in neutral topics. The person wanted to understand whether a learning management system could be used to predict if students would drop out of an online college course. This study in particular does not link to issues of equity or justice, to be honest. But as I mentioned before, most big data projects don't. It's what we do with that afterwards. That being said, Garish, the researcher here, was able to effectively predict which students would drop out of the online course by just looking at their clickstream data habits. So by looking at what students were showing up to the online class, looking if they were talking in the forums, looking if they were even just like literally logging on and logging off, he was able to predict which students would drop out by week 4. Again, his research was neutral, but the research presented a unique opportunity that I feel, potentially, we feel and should feel out there in this room, that analyzing the patterns of black children online can be used to understand what's being missed in the classroom and what's happening when they leave the classroom and go home. This space is an opportunity that's very exciting to me, and I hope that as we get into our small groups we can talk more about it. Again, I have a hard time wrapping my mind around it all the time, but that doesn't mean we can't all lean in and figure it out together. The final example I want to point out to you is close to home and a little more negative. In 2017, Boston Public Schools partnered with MIT to build an algorithm that was meant to redistribute the busing routes to be more equitable. The reality was, the question they wanted to know is, can we create busing routes which primary goal was to reduce the spending on busing, and then secondarily, basically improve student health in high school by giving high school students a later start date, which have been linked to higher attendance rates and better health. So they crunched the numbers, they put all this information into an algorithm, and all an algorithm is simply a recipe for baking a cake, getting dressed in the morning. You all have routines. An algorithm is basically saying, how do I get from my house to work and not look like a fool? They tried to pull that off, but what they forgot to put into the numbers was how parents would react. Y'all laughing because y'all know. So the parent reaction was less than ideal. Before the project was even finished and up and running, wealthy families didn't want to change the status quo, shocker. And poor families were unable, and mostly people of color, were unable to find additional, basically child care or change their schedules around so they could pick up their kids on time. Now ultimately the project was scrapped and it cost the city a bundle of money. Now, beyond being a negative example, there's something about this I want you all to take away. And it's contrast what we saw with Meredith Rosser's example. That in reality, mathematical objectivity does not equal equity. In that when an algorithm that promises to address an inequality doesn't center around the people who feel left out and are essentially unequal in the eyes of not only technology but the people, that nothing good can come of it. While there are a number of reasons why this plan didn't work out, and I'm sure there might be some people who know somebody who was on that MNT project, so no shade, and I'm just trying to be accurate here. The underlying issue here is this belief in false objectivity. So going back to the idea of this promise of big data, there is a belief that technology could transcend humanity and create fairness. But it is clear that this is not true. You cannot have fairness and equity without centering it around the people who are most impacted. So hopefully we've addressed these questions and planted some seeds. And again, as I mentioned before, big data in our lives acts in primarily invisible ways. So today our goal was to kind of highlight and bring some of those invisible things to the visible world. That in the good, it's a tool to redefine the way we observe and interact with the world and shape the world. It is also a tool to highlight resource inequality, how to mitigate implicit bias, and how to provide proactive change that helps struggling populations face challenges that are inherently unequal and structurally there. At the same time, when the people most impacted are left out of the conversation, these tools are just another way to oppress. And when overtrust in big data can continue to be and when you overtrust in big data, you can continue to perpetuate centuries-old structural oppression veiled in false objectivity. So again, as we move into our small groups, I want you to take a deep breath, because I need to. And I hope that you all see in yourselves today and are encouraged to imagine a world using big data. Not just what's already in your toolkit, but grabbing something new. I was supposed to have my fanny pack on, but grabbing something new and putting it in your fanny pack metaphorically. And envision creating tools that can build this into a reality. So with the time that we have, I hope I didn't, I know y'all got to get out of your own time, so I hope we can just move into this kind of creative space of collaborating together and kind of addressing some of these questions in small groups. How could big data support education justice for Black children? So in the first 5 minutes or so, I want you all to kind of think through, what resonated with what I showed you, what ideas it sparked in you, and there will be a series of questions that we can kind of walk through as the process goes along. But I just want to thank you all for giving me your time and your space, and I want to give it back to you and hear from you all.